Good morning. Welcome to the seminar on fiscal institution building during a pandemic. My name is Sanjeev Gupta, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. The COVID-19 pandemic is having a major impact on economic output and public finances of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And these countries are using fiscal policy to mitigate the pandemic's overall impact, promote recovery, and shield the most vulnerable population groups. So in sub-Saharan Africa, countries have announced fiscal packages which amount to 3% of GDP, of which nearly 3/4 of 1 percentage point they have allocated to increasing health spending. Understandably, given the fiscal situation in many of these countries, they are financing part of this increased outlays by cutting back on current and capital spending. So these packages, let's keep in mind, are much smaller than what you find in advanced countries and some other emerging markets. In some of the advanced economies, the packages have ended up amounting to more than 30% of GDP. And some of you who are following the developments in the US, another package is in the offing. And governments in sub-Saharan Africa have undertaken these spending increases in the face of revenue decline, which is estimated to average about 2.6% of GDP. Now, this is a big decline, and of course, we will be discussing this in our panel. Given that in the last 20 years, the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have raised their tax to GDP ratio by about 2 percentage points of GDP. So they have that 2 percentage point of GDP was what they gained in 20 years on average, and the decline as a result of the pandemic is almost 2.6 percentage points of GDP. So what that means is that the fiscal deficits would almost double to 7.6% of GDP on average in 2020, and debt to GDP ratio would rise by almost an equivalent amount to 65% of GDP on average, which is again a high number. So this is the background in Africa. So against this background, so what we are going to be looking at in this seminar is how are the countries in sub-Saharan Africa responding to these fiscal challenges posed by the pandemic, and how governments and providers of technical assistance are working together to sustain development of human and institutional capacity. And to discuss all these issues, we have a great lineup of panel. At the outset, I would like to note that Kenneth Mungabe, who was scheduled to join us today, had to drop out because of some urgent engagement. So let me start by introducing the panel now. The first person in the panel is Elizabeth Mayo. She's Commissioner for Domestic Taxes in Kenya Revenue Authority. She has 29 years of experience in tax administration. And Ms. Mayo has been behind many important tax reforms implemented in Kenya's tax system. She holds degrees in law and finance and is a certified public accountant. Then comes Grace Mozilla, who is currently the Secretary of Development and Budget in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development in Botswana. She has a long experience of 30 years in the government, and in addition to the position in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, Grace is on the board of Botswana Water Utilities and of the Okavango Diamond Company. Larry McDonald's is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Technical Assistance Policy in the US Treasury. He oversees Treasury's Technical Assistance Program in public financial management and financial sector to approximately 50 countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, Central and Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union. Larry also has worked for the OECD. I should note that this seminar would not have been possible without Larry's help and guidance. In fact, the suggestion for organizing it came from him. Finally, Manal Fuad is chief of one of the two public financial management divisions at the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. She oversees the capacity building in public financial management in Francophone and Lusophone Africa, Asia and Pacific, and Western Hemisphere. And since other panelists are bringing experience for Anglophone Africa, Manal will share useful insights in capacity building from other regions of Africa. And for the audience, if you have questions for the panelists, please submit them to events at cgdev.org or tweet at cgdsdev or at CGD Talks, or submit your comments via YouTube. You can also use the chat function of Zoom. So let me start with the first question, and I was going to ask Elizabeth. Now, Kenya has responded to the pandemic by implementing a number of fiscal measures, and some of them have included lowering the value-added tax. Others have included giving tax concessions to businesses. So the question is, are they sufficient to mitigate the impact on households and businesses? And how are these measures going to impact Kenya's fiscal situation going forward? What are your plans going beyond the crisis? So let me start with Elizabeth, and then I will go to Grace.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. The first question is on how Kenya has responded to the pandemic by implementing various fiscal measures and the impact of this, and moving forward, are this sufficient? So what I can say is that the government has set aside 0.4% of GDP, that is roughly $400 million US. Sorry, my video was off. $400 million US for especially health services, because we really need to pull most of our resources to the health sector, so that we. The government has 0.4. Hello, Sanjeev, I'm getting some noise.
Yeah, I know, but I think go on, please. Yeah.
Okay. So I was saying that in order to deal with the pandemic, apart from dealing with the tax rates and whatever, the government looked at the impact of COVID on the business community, especially the small taxpayers. When you look at performance of our taxpayers from the time we declared this in Kenya, our revenue has declined by more than 50%. And this means that most of the businesses have actually closed down. Some of them have downsized. Some of them have actually even gone to an extent of reducing, that is, pay cuts for their employees. So what has the government done, especially in cases where most businesses were closed? And what we did in Kenya was to have a curfew, which runs from 7 to 5 from 5 in the morning to 7. Now it has been improved, it goes up to 9. This means that even the businesses which are operating have got limited time to operate. So what has the government done so that they can look at the impact of this and to help taxpayers. So the government of Kenya set aside 400 million US dollars for health services, and there's also cash transfers to low-income earners. And there is also social protection fund and funds meant for relief food. And this was meant to maintain cash flow for businesses during the pandemic. So what did we do in the financial year budget 2020-2021 that was just concluded in June this year? So there was an additional 56.6 million, that is 0.5% of the GDP, that economic stimulus, which the government came up as a package to help the small, that is the SMEs. And this will go also towards helping the youth, the unemployed across the country. And in Kenya, we call it Kazi Mtaani, which means it is meant to help those unemployed people who actually are also affected by this pandemic, because most of the small businesses they were dealing in have actually been closed, or they cannot operate full time because of the curfew. So there is also provision of credit guarantees and increased cash transfer funds. All these are geared towards ensuring flow of cash in the market and sustaining livelihood in the homes. So in terms of taxation, what measures did the Kenya government do? So we have a package of tax measures which were undertaken, especially the income tax and the VAT regimes. So the first one is income tax relief to persons earning below Kenya shillings 225 per month. In terms of the tax bracket, we increase it such that if you are earning between 13,000 to 24,000 Kenya shillings, then it means that you will not be taxed. Then there was also reduction in terms of rates for pay as you earn, that payroll taxes, from what it was 30% to 25%. So that reduction of 5% actually increases the purchasing power of the people. Then in terms of corporation tax, the rate was also reduced from 30% to 25%. And we have a tax called turnover tax for the small taxpayers. The rate used to be 3%, so we reduced it to 1%, such that it covers for that impact that has been caused by COVID. Then the reduced tax band rates created a new purchasing power for the small citizens, and it also increases the increase in purchasing power triggers increase in production to meet market demands, which keeps more businesses afloat. So this is what the government did, such that the purchasing power can be managed through increase in this bracket of taxpayers will not be able to pay tax. So we have quite a number of taxpayers who are falling within this bracket, which are now not paying tax because their income is now dubbed exempt. Then when we come to VAT, we had a reduction of VAT from 16% rate to 14%. So the 2% decrease has actually helped taxpayers because it reduces the liability of tax payable. Then we also have zero rating. Zero rating in terms of essential commodities. In Kenya, one of our staple food is maize. So maize meal has been zero rated, and zero rating means that it is taxable but at 0%, and the taxpayer can be able to get credit of the input tax and get refund. So that one will have direct impact on the prices of the maize flour, which we have seen significantly has gone down. So the other measure that we took is on VAT refunds. So VAT refunds, we came up with a stimulus package where the government actually injected Kenya shillings 10 billion into Kenya Revenue Authority for purposes of paying these refunds. So the 10 billion has been paid. We paid it within 1 month. And this means that we have increased the money circulation in the economy by actually making sure that the small taxpayers, medium taxpayers, large taxpayers who had refunds are not going to suffer during pandemic. So that one we have done. Then the cash flow was meant to boost the farms which were struggling with cash flows and reduce demand for their products or services in the wake of COVID-19. It was also meant to improve liquidity in the economy and ensure businesses remain afloat by enhancing their cash flows and also increase in production with the new cash injected in the economy. So moving forward, we expect to continue having not affected by this. So what the government package through the Ministry of Trade and all the SMEs who are registered, can you hear me? You cannot start your video because the host has stopped.
Elizabeth,
Hello?
you may want, your video is not on.
Yes, but I can continue?
Yeah, you can continue, but put your video on, please.
Yeah, I'm trying, but it's telling me that the host has stopped it. So I cannot do anything about it.
Oh,
because yeah, now it's there.
okay.
Yes, yeah. I think it's just network challenges. So what I'm saying is that in order to safeguard the livelihood of our SMEs, that is the small taxpayers, the government under the Ministry of Trade has come up with a stimulus package where registered small taxpayers are going to be given some funds to ensure that they remain afloat. So this one is going to be done through a framework which actually is going to be managed through our Ministry of Trade. And likewise, when we do such, it means that there will be that impact of, in terms of tax-based expansion, the people we can get from there. So I think that is all I can say for question number one.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. Perhaps we can now go to Grace. And Grace, so Botswana is a resource-rich country, and so a question that comes to my mind is, how is its response different from the response of the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa? And so what are the key elements of the response? And what does that mean for Botswana's fiscal policy?
Thank you, Sanji, and I want to thank the Center for Global Development for inviting me. And I want to say right away that immediately when COVID hit, before even the declaration, that is the pandemic, we started working very hard in Botswana, knowing that we are a resource-based economy. We started working very hard. We put structures in place. Before even our first case, we had developed an economic response plan. So a team of experts was put together, co-chaired by the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development and the Governor of Bank of Botswana. And we had researchers, lecturers from universities, economists, and they produced a very good plan, which we used for the short term. The plan had 4 strategic objectives. And the first objective was support to workers. And we also had stabilization of business as the second strategic objective. And we had ensuring availability of strategic reserves. You know, we import our food from neighboring countries, and we really wanted to make sure that the grains and everything that we'll need is available. And the fourth one was promoting opportunities for economic diversification. You just talked about Botswana being a resource-rich country. We really are working very hard to diversify the economy. So that plan, as I speak, that's where the wage subsidy comes from. It comes from strategic objective 1, support to workers. We realized when we went for lockdown that most companies were not operating. There was no trade, there was no travel. And we wanted to make sure that when we come back, because our belief was we're going to come back, COVID will not be here forever. We'll come back. So when we come back, we didn't want companies to start recruiting, but we wanted there to be continuity. So we paid the workers a minimum of $100 US, a maximum of $250 US. Of course, then it was 50% of the salary. So if it's beyond 250, you get 250. But if it's below $100 US, you get $100 US. That was enough to keep them afloat. They could pay rent, they could buy grocery. Some of them were not even going to offices because there was nothing happening. But for the 3 months, they managed, they went back after the lockdown, and now businesses are running without the wage subsidy. I don't know where these companies would be. We will now be recruiting and it will delay development. In our case, we are not only saving lives. We thought we should, at the same time as we save lives, make sure that we work on the economic recovery. So at the same time as we're finalizing the response plan, the same team started working on the recovery plan. And as I'm talking to you now, Cabinet has already considered the first draft of the recovery plan, and they're going to be looking at it again next week. And it's going to Parliament either late this month or in August. So there's a lot of activity at the moment. But maybe I should touch on what happened, because we are unique. If you look at our revenue situation, we get our revenue from diamonds. Mm-hmm. And we had forecasted something like 20 billion pula, and we got only half of that. The forecasts are now, the revised forecast, are 10. And those forecasts, we had used them as we did the budget, which means that some of the expenditure will not have money, because the forecast is now like 50% of what we forecasted. So the mineral revenue was very much affected. The other item which was affected was VAT. Our VAT is very lowest at 12%, but it went down by 1 billion pula. The income tax, you know, when there's no activity, there's no travel, income tax is also affected. It was affected, it moved from 14 billion to 11 billion. And you can see the loss there, which means that we had to revisit our expenditure. And we did that, we reprioritized, but we didn't want to make huge cuts, because at the same time, we don't want the economy to collapse. So minimal cuts were made. And at the same time, we started approaching private sector. We established a special fund, and private sector started contributing money in the special fund. Government deposited $200 million US, 2 billion pula, and into this special fund. And immediately we started paying items like wage subsidy. We started buying food hampers. We started procuring the PPEs, all these medical supplies using the special fund. And we had mobilized funds from other special funds so that we don't worsen the deficit. So the situation is very different from other countries because of we are unique as Botswana. The deficit, we had a deficit of 2.4% of GDP when we prepared our budget. By the way, when COVID hit, we had just finalized preparing the budget. Our financial year starts on the 1st of April. So we had just completed finalizing our budget with a deficit of 2.4%. We had a rule which says we shouldn't exceed 4% of GDP. So we were below the 4%. COVID hit, and the deficit went up as 6.4%. So it's beyond our threshold. But because we want to grow the economy, we made forecast, and we realized that by the end of the plan period, 22-23, we'll come back to the threshold rather than stop business. At the same time, we are thinking, why don't we then start borrowing, thinking of borrowing? But we are prioritizing initially domestic borrowing from our commercial banks, and then we'll go out to multilateral, bilateral after the domestic. That is the priority list which we are discussing now. So borrowing is also going to be, we'll have to borrow because the deficit is quite on the high side. Fortunately, we have reforms. We started implementing reforms as far back as 2010. And in a situation like this, our reforms are very responsive. So we started, we enhanced the zero-based budgeting. We introduced other reforms for revenue forecasting. And we realized that there's under collection, even for VAT. So we are going to be making sure that we improve the collection using reforms which are on the table. We are currently working on a new roadmap. The roadmap which we drafted for reforms from 2010, it was up to 2020. So as we do a new roadmap, we'll factor in other initiatives which will help us get out of this situation. We don't believe that we'll be in this situation for more than a year. Already we are forecasting 7.7 growth by 2020, 21-22. After a decline GDP of minus 8.9%. When we did the budget, we had forecasted 4.4% growth. So now it's a minus 8.9%, which is unfortunate. But we don't believe we'll stay there for a long time. We have fiscal rules which are helping us. Like we are restricting our borrowing to 40% of GDP. As I'm talking to you now, we are sitting on 22%. 11% domestic, 11% external, and the target is 2020, making 40. So we have space, and we keep these figures this low, knowing that if there could be some issues like COVID, then we will have space to borrow. Even the spending, we say we are not supposed to spend more than 30% of GDP. And when you look at our expenditure figures for 2020-21, indeed, we are around that. Our total expenditure is around 30% of GDP, which of course went down a bit from 222 billion. The GDP has gone down to 190 billion. But we expect it to peak because there is already activity. Very soon we are going to be starting to sell the diamonds. So that's what we are doing as Botswana. There are structures which have been put in place. At the apex, we have the president chairing a task team, and there is continuous engagement, and there's proactiveness because we have structures even in the districts which are working with these structures in central government. So the engagement, the proactiveness, I think it's really helping us as a nation to mitigate the impact, and also on prevention side. It has been spreading, but not that much, because there is so much activity in terms of engaging people and making sure that they follow the protocols. So we also have a relief fund which I chair, the management committee, and it's doing a good job. We have spent more than $1 billion already, Pula, from the fund, and we have some balances, and it's a very busy assignment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you for your elaborate response. Larry, can I turn to you now? And given your very vast portfolio of overseeing capacity development in different parts of the world, so the question that arises is, how's the US government helping countries in Africa to deal with the crisis? And how is it different from other regions of the world?
So thank you, Sanjeev. Let me say what a pleasure it is to take part in this panel with good friends and distinguished colleagues from around the world and from around Washington. Let me start with a general observation about fiscal institution building during a pandemic, something that we're all learning about as we try to live through it. And that observation is that the pandemic has intensified everything. building strong fiscal institutions is a challenge, it seems to me, even in the best of times. And trying to do that during a pandemic when the economy is under duress and government officials and their assistance partners are working remotely is beyond challenging. I would say it's a little like trying to build an airplane even as you are flying it. In other words, it's hard to be working on improvements when you're just trying to get through the day. And I must say that I'm very impressed with the set of actions and measures that Elizabeth and Grace have already described. That is an extraordinary accomplishment under these circumstances. Anyway, today's discussion, I think, can help us assess how our collaborations during the pandemic are going, what's working reasonably well, what's not. And as importantly, I think it can help us prepare for the time when the pandemic is diminishing and ending. There's going to be a lot of important decisions to make about which adjustments that have been taken during the pandemic should continue, which ones you want to build upon that have proven their effectiveness, and probably also which ones you want to roll back, things that you have done during the pandemic in extremis, but you may not want to make a permanent feature of your public financial management system and your approach to fiscal matters. So I think today's discussion really can help illuminate those things. Now, as for how the U.S. government is helping countries in Africa deal with the crisis, there are a couple of dimensions to this, in particular, U.S. bilateral assistance, and secondly, U.S. support for multilateral initiatives. I'll address each one of these, but let me start with the one that I know best, the work of Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance, or OTA, as we refer to it in shorthand. So OTA is partnering with finance ministries, central banks, and other government financial institutions in developing countries in Africa and other regions to help them build capacity in revenue mobilization, debt management, budget and financial accountability, oversight of financial institutions, and combating economic crimes. Currently, Treasury's Technical Assistance Program has projects in 26 projects in 15 sub-Saharan African countries. Our work in sub-Saharan Africa represents about a third of our technical assistance engagements worldwide. So Africa is a very important and substantial part of our global effort. We are indeed partnering with each of the African countries represented in today's webinar. We're delighted to be working closely with Grace and Elizabeth and their respective teams on a couple of things that I'll describe now. And I would say that our work in Botswana and Kenya is representative of our assistance across sub-Saharan Africa. Each project is a little different. In each country, there are different areas of focus, but they're representative. So in Botswana, OTA budget experts are supporting the migration to program budgeting. They're helping our Botswanan partners assess budget options, as Grace referred to them, helping them cost out budget proposals, make decisions about prioritization. So several things that are at the heart of strengthening public finance management. A second OTA team is working with Botswana's Financial Intelligence Unit to strengthen AML-CFT the regime. That sounds like a far cry from fiscal institution building, but I would say that there are some important connections between strengthening the AML-CFT regime and strengthening the environment for sound fiscal policy management. In Kenya, a country where OTA has been engaged for quite a while, we have revenue experts working closely with Elizabeth and her team on strengthening capacity in corporate planning, monitoring and evaluation, and strengthening capacity in debt management as relates to tax administration. A second OTA team is working with the National Treasury to establish a debt management office to strengthen its functions as part of a broader effort to enhance debt issuance and management. Kenya has performed actually quite well in terms of debt issuance and management, including domestically, during the pandemic. And I feel like the partnership that has existed there for quite some time is showing the benefits during the pandemic. And I would also say that these two areas of assistance, revenue management and debt management and debt market development, they're extremely complementary. They're two of the pillars of public financial management and are extremely important for fiscal objectives. Now, how is this going? I mean, it's one thing to say what areas we're working in, but I think something we ought to take a look at is just how is it going during the pandemic? I mean, I will say that it has really forced us, and I'm talking about OTA, and I think also other assistance providers, to improvise. Our long-standing approach and our preferred approach to capacity building is to work side by side directly with our counterparts right in their institutions on a sustained basis over a period of months or even years. And for reasons that we all understand, that has just not been possible for the past 4 months. We've been, improvising, trying to provide assistance remotely via video conferences such as this, emails, telephone, basically any way that works. And if I were to assess how that's been going, I mean, honestly, it's been difficult and it is suboptimal. I am eager to get back to a day when we can engage with our partners in the way that we have traditionally. But, we're learning. We are addressing bugs in the systems. We are learning from this experience. And I feel like, but I certainly welcome input from Grace and Elizabeth. I feel like we are still providing assistance that is reasonably timely, not as timely as we would like, and is supporting the extraordinary measures that they are undertaking. So that's for OTA. Now, in terms of U.S. assistance more broadly, of course, OTA's work is part of that broader picture. The U.S. government, primarily via the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department, has stepped up assistance in response to COVID-19. So the U.S. has pledged an additional $1.3 billion in assistance, specifically related to COVID-19 measures, of which $410 million would be directed to sub-Saharan Africa. This assistance takes the form of health, humanitarian, and economic support. So that is the broader picture of U.S. government engagement. And I would be remiss if I did not say a quick word about U.S. efforts to support multilateral initiatives. This work is taking place in partnership with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the international financial institutions, with the G7 and the G20. We have other experts on the call today who represent at least the IMF. So I will focus on one initiative that's extremely important and relates to debt. So the U.S. has, along with all the other G20 official bilateral creditors, including China, has committed to suspending debt service payments from the poorest countries through the end of this year. If all official bilateral creditors do their part, we'll be able to channel up to $11.5 billion in resources to low-income countries, meeting the unprecedented needs that Grace and Elizabeth have described. More than half of this 11.5 billion, in other words, about 6.6 billion, would benefit sub-Saharan African countries. So of the 11.5 total 6.6 billion would benefit sub-Saharan African countries. You know, there is a lot going on bilaterally, and not only from the United States, of course. There are many other partner countries working with their African colleagues. But that is an overview of what the United States is doing and attempting to do, and a little bit about how it's been going in terms of assistance delivery. Thanks, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you so much for this elaboration, because this was needed to put everything in a perspective. Manal, I'm going to now turn to you. I forgot to introduce that Manal and I were colleagues for a number of years, and she is now overseeing this capacity building in large parts of the world in the public financial management area. So, and Larry already talked about how providing assistance remotely is not the optimal way to go, but this is constrained. I remember getting involved in providing this assistance remotely in Western Africa at the time of the Ebola crisis. But at that time, we were able to bring the teams to Paris for discussions, but now we can't do any of that. So, Manal, can you tell us what kind of challenges you're facing in providing capacity building assistance in the countries in Africa you cover? Are you able to respond to the countries in the same way as you did before the crisis? Larry already alluded to some of the constraints that US advisors are facing. What is your experience? And of course, we'll go back to the country panelists to find out what is their reaction to this. But before that, could you please tell us what your experience is?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah,
Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for the question, Sanjeev, and thank you for inviting me to this prestigious panel. I'm very happy to be here and share with you our experience. So, as you know, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the biggest recipients of fiscal capacity development in our department, in Fiscal Affairs Department. It represents half of our capacity development delivery, and about a quarter of this goes to fragile states in Africa. We have a big presence on the ground with the 5 regional technical assistance centers, and we also have a number of resident advisors on the ground in many countries, either in the RTAX, the AfriTax, or working directly with ministries of finance or tax authorities. Just in my division, we have 15 people on the ground, and also a large network of short-term experts that provide hands-on capacity development in countries. So of course, when the pandemic started, we've had to stop all travel, evacuate some staff from the field, and this has necessarily resulted in some disruptions. A lot of what I'll say also resonates with what Larry has just mentioned. But I would like to say the challenges are twofold. First, in terms of the delivery modality, and as I just mentioned, our traditional way of delivering TA and training on the ground was interrupted by the pause in travel, by the work from home, both here and in the countries that we're helping, social distancing, including for those who remained in the field. So let's say they couldn't go to the ministry or so on. So they were also working from home. The second challenge is more in terms of continuity of medium-term reforms and for institution building, which, as you can imagine, was put on hold or derailed due to much more urgent priorities to contain the pandemic and provide support to people and firms. So maybe I'll focus more on the challenges in providing TA support, which has required us to find innovative approaches to respond in a timely manner to requests. So from the onset, we've reacted in sort of an agile and integrated fashion, focusing on the needs of member countries. We worked very closely, us in headquarters and our staff in the field and in the AfriTax, also with the African department of the IMF, which has been very involved. And I would like to highlight 3 ways for us in terms of delivering capacity development and institution building in response to the crisis. First, we quickly shifted to remote and virtual capacity development delivery. So we continue to deliver this capacity development through a structured approach, but we adapted it to the new circumstances of doing things remotely. And the shift was quite fast. It happened in early March already, as soon as international travel stopped. So for instance, my division was supposed to start a mission in Senegal on micro-fiscal frameworks and management of natural resources. Their trip was canceled a couple of days before traveling, but we have shifted it to a remote mission. It was one of the first remote missions. At that time, it was a little bit easier because things were still open in Senegal, so the authorities could use the ResRep office, and there was more mobility in the country. Of course, as things evolved, this became more and more difficult. But in general, we've since the lockdown, we've delivered about 25 remote missions between headquarters mission and short-term expert missions. And also our long-term expert in the field delivered about 45 activities. Some of our staff actually have relocated in Europe to be closer to their families, and this is actually very helpful because of the time difference, so they can get a head start compared to us here and are closer to our partners and our authorities in Africa. The second way that we also responded to the crisis is to do many more webinars, a bit like this one, where we bring together groups of countries and have some peer-to-peer exchanges on COVID-related issues and how they responded. We've had 11 of these webinars so far in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and we have very positive feedback from countries. So just as examples, my division, which covers WAIMU and CEMAC countries who share the same sort of PFM regulatory frameworks and directives, we've had these parallel webinars for WAIMU and then for CEMAC, and also for Portuguese-speaking countries on very specific issues like adapting the PFM systems to COVID-19, treasury single account and cash management in the context of COVID funds and donor funding, expenditure controls during the COVID-19, how to manage voluntary contribution funds, a little bit like what Grace mentioned earlier, advanced degrees. So these are all very specific to Francophone countries, and the sharing of experience, I think, is really very, very much appreciated by countries, and we learn a lot from it as well. And we just facilitate, make a short presentation, and then really stimulate the discussion. The third is that we have, and this Sanjeev, you will recognize this. We've opened a sort of an on-demand CD request system where the countries can request capacity development very quickly. It's basically an email address whereby they can just send either a request for a capacity development activity or just questions. And it doesn't have to go through the bureaucratic procedure to agree on having to field the mission. It can happen very quickly. And a number of countries have already made use to it, of this, particularly Madagascar, for instance. But you asked about the challenges. So I think we have to recognize that remote CD delivery does not come without challenges. And just to mention a few, the length of the mission. So usually we go for 10 days or 2 weeks, focus, have intensive meetings, and then we're done, we leave a report. With the remote delivery, missions take much longer because virtual meetings, we cannot do virtual meetings the whole day. So partly because of time difference, but also because our counterparts, the authorities, have a lot of other work to do. It's difficult to be in front of a screen for the whole day and be productive. So we've been having much longer missions with shorter meetings during the day. Another challenge is to mobilize counterpart teams, which may also slow the mission and make it longer. Again, as I said, they are really at the forefront of the crisis, so a lot of work to do, and the IMF mission is only part of the engagement that they can have. Another challenge is the depth of the mission. So it's a little bit more challenging to go in depth. First, data collection is not as easy. Sometimes we just have to knock at the doors and wait for data to be delivered remotely. This is not as easy. In some cases also, our counterparts can be reluctant to discuss sensitive information over remote technologies. So we don't get as much of an in-depth discussion. And then also, it's hard to get the full attention of the senior staff and ministers, again, because of just the situation in which we are. And then finally, on technology, I think we were positively surprised. I think we've always been a bit inhibited and reluctant to use technology, but it has worked much better than we thought. But of course, it's not easy. In some very low capacity countries, actually, there's no internet at the Ministry of Finance, or at least for all technical staff. So there are no VTC facilities. There are also the online security considerations and the connectivity issues that varies a lot. So we've tried to be a bit creative. We sometimes use WhatsApp, just even messages, recorded messages, etc., to get the work done. And we're trying really our best to establish this connection. But so on the whole, I think we consider that we've done quite a bit in order to overcome the difficulties of not having a physical presence. And I think this will actually also remain as a legacy. We will be able to do things virtually and remotely also going forward. This has actually helped a much more inclusive approach because we're not constrained by the communication and the travel barriers. So in meetings with the authorities, we can include other donor partners or the Africa department teams. So it's actually been a more inclusive approach than our physical mission. So our support is likely to continue to increase in that way. We also think that when things return to normal, we will have a hybrid model of remote and in the field presence, and sort of learn from the lessons from this crisis. And as I said, our support is likely to increase in the coming month, and we'll continue to listen and innovate and deliver the best that we can. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So, okay, thank you, Manal, for a very detailed description of the IMF's work in capacity building and the modifications that have occurred as a result of the COVID-19. Let me now go back to Elizabeth Mayo. You've heard from Larry and Manal how US government and international agencies are now modifying their way of doing technical assistance. So the question that arises is, how are you now working under these conditions with different providers of technical assistance to reform Kenya's tax system, and what challenges are you going to face down the line on making the reforms? And has COVID made it easier and more difficult to reform the tax system? You have been involved in reforming the tax system in Kenya in the last many, many years. So the issue is you're working with advisors from the US government, you're working with other agencies. How is that going to change as a result of COVID-19?
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. I can start by saying that multilateral collaboration and coordination are very, very vital to increase the effectiveness of countries' responses to stages in their various stages of path to recovery. So in terms of what has been said on capacity building, what I can say, our experience in Kenya is that we have been working very, very well with developing partners. And when we had this outbreak, we had one mission which was to come, IMF, and we thought that we were not going to move. And IMF moved very fast and wrote to us that, yes, we can do it. We are going to do it remotely. And we sat down and asked ourselves, is this going to work? So we had very many engagements. And what I can say is this is a success story. The mission was to strengthen audit and to enhance use of risk management in audit case selection. So we did this remotely. We came up with the teams. They gave us their work plan, their requirement, and we had a schedule of meetings which we were having every week. We had the opening meeting and we had the exit meeting, and everything just went very well. And why am I calling it a success story? According to the recommendations which were given in terms of the gaps that IMF actually identified, we are now implementing and we are rolling out the use of risk management in audit case selection in all our audit centers. So to me, it is a success story such that when they come to review, they'll find that, yes, we have made a mark in Kenya. So the next thing we are doing with the IMF is on development of sector-based risk registers. We didn't have this, and they have taught us how to do this remotely. And our teams are working on it, and it is also helping in strengthening the sector-based knowledge base. Then we have also engaged IMF to help us in the area of digital tax service. We are introducing this, and in the last budget, it was introduced starting in January 2021. So already we have requested for technical assistance from IMF, and the regional office, that is East Africa, is very, very instrumental in this. And they have picked that and put in their work plan for the year 2021-22. So we know we are going to work with them. Then in strengthening debt, we had a mission ongoing, and immediately we had the pandemic outbreak. The TA team wrote to us and told us we will continue. We don't need to be there physically. So we are still continuing on this. And this is another success story where we have most of our debt, especially debt less than 100 million Kenya shillings, is being collected through our call center, which means we have incorporated our marketing and communication team in debt collection. And they have come up with a very, very good system where we collect debt immediately the debt is created, because you all know the longer the debt takes, the more it becomes very, very difficult to collect. So we sincerely thank IMF on that. Then we are also working very closely with USAID. And USAID is also helping us in not only in debt recovery, but also in other projects. So all these things we are doing remotely. We don't have any mission staff with us in Kenya, but work is moving as if they are here with us. So those are most of the cases we are working on. Then we are also coming up with a project called cashless payments, because we are encouraging most of the transactions, especially the taxpayers, to tend not to use cash because of COVID. If they can go cashless by using debit cards, using what we call M services, then that one will help. So this one, we are actually partnering with the private sector, and we are doing it also remotely. And all the presentations are done remotely. And once the proposal is accepted by our top management, it is going to be implemented. So capacity building in audit and in the extractive industry is another area where IMF is helping Kenya, and it is something which is ongoing. They started by coming up with the program on training, and they came up and developed a framework through which we involved in even the Ministry of Energy in this. So it is ongoing, and what I can say that it has really, really improved capacity within our large taxpayers. The main challenges we are seeing are, one, security of data. We noted that when we were dealing with the IMF on audit, provision of data was a problem, because we were looking at, if we give this data, how safe is it that we are giving it out? Then the other challenge we are having is on connectivity. We have areas with very, very poor network. So how do you deal with such? So most of the concentration is within our large taxpayers, within Nairobi, the headquarters, and the large stations. But do we leave the small stations out? So that is a challenge we are actually working on. The other one was on mobilizing the team to come together so that they can believe that, yes, we can do it remotely, because people were used to having the technical team visiting the authority and having meetings with the authority. So right now we can see the buy-in, there is acceptance, and that actually is changing. So I can say that with our development partners, we are doing very well. They are helping us. And recently, actually, we sent a request through the capacity development window that if we can be assisted with the digital service tax, because this is starting next year, and internally we feel we really don't have capacity to deal with that. So those are the key highlights, and thank you so much, Sanjeev. You can hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Thank you so much. And I just have to unmute myself, so it takes a minute. So let me now turn to Grace, and thank you so much, Elizabeth, for a very interesting response. Grace, so how are you working with different providers of technical systems in Botswana? And, you know, Manal talked about what she called a hybrid model, where some things are done remotely, others are done, through advisors. And Larry expressed that it's not necessarily the most optimal way of doing assistance. But what is your experience in Botswana? Do you think this is something which should or could be sustained over a period of time, and would that serve your objectives?
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you, Larry. Thank you, Manal. I think for Botswana, like I indicated earlier, We don't have any concessionary loans. We don't have any grants. I was just looking at our 2020-21 budget, and our grant for the year, it's $30 million US. And I compare with other countries and I say, oh my God, 30 million. And when we get this type of assistance, both the OTA and the Fiscal Affairs Department, we are very grateful, because whereas we can't get any grant resources from anywhere because of our status, we are able to get support. We are able to get the technical assistance and do some of these things which we could have done with the grant. So it's just like a grant. And the way we have been working with them, very effective. And I don't want to say that now, because we are not together, all is lost. It has been very slow, especially during the lockdown, and even after the lockdown, because most of the people, the teams who were working with the team from OTA and even IMF, they got engaged with COVID assignments. So there has been a very slowness for the past 2-3 months. But we have a plan now, because most of the COVID assignments are now being integrated in different departments, in different ministries. So they will create space for these teams who are working with the reforms people to work with the OTA team. I know I talk to some of them. I make sure that on a weekly basis, I talk to Shanti, I talk to Tom, I talk to Robert, just for us to make sure that all is not lost. Just last week, we had a meeting with Robert and team, and we were discussing the new roadmap, which I talked about earlier, for the PFM reform. From the PEFA assessment, we are doing a roadmap, 6-year roadmap for the implementation of the reforms. And thank you very much, because you have provided TA to assist us. Last week, we had a virtual meeting, and it was very effective, even with presentation virtually. So what we can do, because some of the African countries, including some ministries in Botswana, the networks are not that good. We just need to improve the areas and continue with these meetings, because they can be very effective and saving even on time. For now, they are not that much effective because of issues of network, which we will work on. So we are okay, we are working. The OTA, the budget support, when the team left, because immediately then traveling was challenged, they all disappeared. They had to go and join their families. But they went at a stage where we are left with maybe a couple of weeks or so before we could finalize. So we have been working remotely to finalize the report. And the decision we took because of COVID is, why pilot zero-based budgeting? We had piloted 6 ministries. Why don't we just implement? And last month we took a decision where we are going to be implementing zero-based budgeting for all ministries starting financially 2021, 2022. So these are some of the benefits which are coming with COVID. There are challenges, of course, but it's making us move a bit faster, because we want issues of efficiencies to be addressed now, especially for Botswana, where when you look at the revenue, it's almost gone, and we need to really talk about efficiencies, either in collection or in spending, financing. We really have to be talking efficiencies. So the PIMA report was done, and there are follow-ups, and we are using virtual meetings to do those things, and it's very effective. The challenge was only that it was a very slow start, but now it's picking up, and we are happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace. It's good to hear that Botswana is using this crisis to move faster on reforms. That's a good piece of news. And so let me now turn to Larry. And the issue here is, so looking at the current challenges posed by the pandemic, are donors, including yourself, well positioned to provide assistance to counterpart countries as they emerge from the pandemic. So this is what is the plan going forward from the perspective of the US Treasury. Larry, thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. So I'd answer this question in two ways. And I'd also like to pick up on a couple of points that were made by Elizabeth and Grace about potential future assistance needs. So first of all, I feel confident, I feel very confident that the United States, both the Treasury Department's Technical Assistance Program and US assistance more broadly, will continue to deliver a range of robust support to Africa. Like nobody can predict the future with total accuracy, but I would just say that there is a long-standing foundation of U.S. bilateral assistance to Africa that is going to continue. Take a number of different forms. Certainly, the work of the Office of Technical Assistance at Treasury is going to continue. Other examples, but this is just a subset, include the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, a major program in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Power Africa, the importance of generating additional power in African countries for a whole range of reasons is still there, and the U.S. will continue to engage in that. And there are a number of initiatives that are going to continue. And one of the questions that I'm asking myself as we, Treasury, are involved in the early stages of budget request formulations for ourselves is how are future needs going to evolve? And this is the second part of my answer. Some things at this point are how well we're positioned. How well we're positioned will depend on some things that are unknown. How well donors are positioned will depend in part on the evolution of the pandemic. If it is in decline and God help us, ends within a period of months, we're going to be much better positioned than if the pandemic continues, across the world for the unforeseeable future. So that's one thing. But I think another important dimension is what are the future priority needs of our counterparts. I'm sure that assistance in building fiscal institutions and public financial management more broadly will continue. But I noted with interest a couple of things here. Elizabeth spoke of the importance of security of data. That is something that OTA is very much focused on. We're not alone in that, of course. It's always been important to have secure information and data systems. I have a feeling that the pandemic has made that only more important. As we have moved to online ways of doing things, as more kinds of operations are being conducted digitally, I just have the sense that the security of information systems, cybersecurity, as well as other things, is only going to be enhanced. And so OTA is in the process of building our capacity, our ability to provide additional assistance in that area. So I'm interested to hear that that's something that is on the mind of our counterparts. Look, I think that there are going to be different points where we as donors and development partners are going to come together to assess the state of play. I think today's event has certainly been one of them and has been very helpful. I think the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank coming up in October will be another very important opportunity to assess the conditions globally in terms of economic and financial circumstances, but also the evolving assistance needs. So, that's how I would answer that question, Sanjeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, so much for your answer. Manal, can you give us some examples of where the IMF has been able to respond to the capacity building needs in the context of the crisis in the recent months? And especially because we are looking at more at Anglophone Africa. Perhaps you can draw on some experience from Francophone Africa as well to give us some examples.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Sanjeev. So yes, I think it's clear that sub-Saharan Africa, like all parts of the world, the pandemic has put considerable strain and stress on governments to quickly adjust and address the impact of the pandemic by increasing health spending, but also providing support to people and firms. And this gave rise to new types of needs and urgencies, and in the CD in the capacity development that we have provided. I think Grace and Elizabeth mentioned a few, but just to say, in general, in tax and policy and revenue administration, there was a lot of demand on how to support firms and households through changes in tax policies, while protecting revenue collection, streamlining or redesigning tax expenditures. A very, I think, an area where that we've done a lot of work is also how to ensure business continuity, how to adjust the medium-term revenue strategy in order to ease the recovery. These are just a few examples. On the expenditure policy and PFM, there are even more issues, starting by how to reprioritize spending to find fiscal space for emergency spending, how to manage cash in the context of lower revenue and donor support, what are the legal provisions to change spending composition, how to prepare supplementary budgets, what expenditure controls are appropriate, because with the pandemic, there's a need for more flexibility, but at the same time, we have to ensure proper accountability. Issues related to SOEs, whether they are part of providing public policies or they are suffering from financially from the crisis. Digital solutions also to support cash transfers, how to track and report crisis spending. So these are all themes that have come up and countries have struggled with during the crisis and requested our support. So on tax policy, I mean, several, and Elizabeth and Grace mentioned some of these, but we've done remote missions in Senegal, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, covering a wide range of issues, starting from business continuity, but also safeguarding revenues, data analytics, review of sectoral action plans, compliance risks, etc. In the area of PFM, we've done also a few missions on cash management and treasury single account, for instance, in Guinea, in the DRC. We've also done some work on sort of the legal frameworks for additional spending and COVID-19 funds. So, and this is not a Francophone country, it's on Sierra Leone. My colleagues have done a mission there on how to manage COVID funds. And actually, one thing here that I would highlight, because I think Grace has been part of this, is that they have also identified neighboring countries or countries from the region who have, very strong legal frameworks and clear management of COVID funds, and set up a seminar for the Sierra Leone authorities. And I think Botswana, and Grace was part of this peer-to-peer exchange which I believe has been very well received. We've also helped a few countries on preparing a supplementary budget, taking COVID-19 into account. So I want to say, other than the country related, we've produced a number of notes that that give some economies of scale in providing support. Some of them were Africa focused. For instance, there is one on managing government support to SOEs for sub-Saharan Africa. There's also a few notes for WIMO and CIMAC countries that are all available online. I think the WIMO and CIMAC countries are available on Afritac West and Afritac Center websites, and the others are on the IMF internet website. I would just like maybe to quickly mention that our message, the IMF message for countries has been do whatever it takes, but keep the receipts. And this has meant that we've also focused very much on issues related to fiscal transparency, accountability, and ex-post controls. And so we have a number of notes that covered recommendations on these areas. I would draw your attention to three. One is called Keeping the Receipts, Transparency, Accountability, and Legitimacy, which stresses the importance of transparency when designing, implementing, and overseeing the response measures, and it has a number of recommendations. Another is on budget execution controls to mitigate corruption vulnerabilities, which draws also on experience from the Ebola crisis, but also elsewhere in more advanced countries on how to manage emergency responses in a transparent way, especially in procurement, preserving integrity of procurement systems and maintaining supply chains. And a third one on digital solutions, also IFMIS systems to maintain transparency and recording, tracking of monitoring. So this is quite important, given that there's been a lot of donor support, emergency funding, and also given the debt support initiative that Larry mentioned earlier. So there is a big focus on transparency, accountability, and ex-post audits. And in this context, I'll also mention very briefly that we think civil society organizations can also play a key role to ensure that the government manages COVID funds appropriately. And last week we had an event held at the Africa Training Institute, well, not at, but by the Africa Training Institute, with over 70 CSOs from Africa that exchange their views on their role and how we can leverage their knowledge and experience. So this is just briefly the types of engagement we've had. And just to mention that we're also trying to keep the momentum of medium-term reform agenda as much as we can, so that it doesn't get relayed, derailed. And so we're continuing to provide also, as Elizabeth and Grace mentioned, other capacity development in sort of more medium-term reform areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Manal. So we are left with about 7 minutes, and there are a couple of questions, but I'm going to pick up two, and they are directed at Elizabeth and Grace. And so, and then I'll sum it up very quickly, not sum it up, but conclude the meeting. So Elizabeth, there is a question that sort of raises the issue of your implementing the measures that you have done in response to COVID-19. And so the issue that the question which one of the participants is asking is there a feedback loop to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of the measures that you have implemented? In other words, are you thinking of looking at these measures and then saying, look, we need to modify this because it's not delivering the required results? So that's the question which has come from one of the participants. And then I have a question for Grace after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. For each and every initiative we have come up in combating COVID-19, especially the stimulus packages, we have come up with a very, very robust implementation plan, a monitoring framework. We have a team just doing the monitoring, and areas where we feel we are not achieving the objectives that the initiative was intended for, we actually go back to the drawing board and check if we can do it differently. Like now we are asking ourselves, are we going to do our work the way we used to do it? No, we have to think of different ways of doing because we have to continue collecting revenue. Kenya Revenue Authority has got a mandate to collect revenue for the government of Kenya. So these initiatives we have come up with to help the taxpayers such that the impact of COVID does not actually force them to close down. So what we are doing is that we have to ensure that the initiatives are also not abused by the beneficiaries, because we have cases where some taxpayers might feel that they're not going to pay because when you ask them, they talk of COVID. So we have come up with a mitigating measure. If this risk occurs, what are we going to do? So we have a framework which actually we follow each and every week. And if we find any initiative is not working, then we have to come up with a strategy that must make it work. So we have a framework, we have a work plan, we have a team just looking at that.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. So let me turn to Grace. That's a relatively straightforward question. The question which has been brought forward is, Botswana had approached IMF and the World Bank for financial support, which the questionnaire is saying was worth $3.4 billion. And did the country receive the support or not? You have to unmute.
Thank you very much, Sanji. I think as I speak, we haven't received the support. When I talked earlier, I indicated that we started here in the domestic market and we are moving to the multi. So I believe it's still to come.
Thank you, Grace. So I think that brings us to the close of the seminar. But so let me draw 2-3 key messages that come out from this meeting. One is that this crisis is posing a lot of challenges for the countries. And countries are adjusting to those challenges in different ways. At the same time, it is presenting opportunities for reform. And Botswana gave the examples of how they are reforming the system in an accelerated manner. The same thing in case of Kenya. Elizabeth explained what is being done. And I think it's a good sign, because the only way to create more fiscal space and to create resources to address the crisis would be by reforming the systems. And perhaps the crisis presents an opportunity to the country authorities to reform. So that's one message that came out. Secondly, I think, and this came out from Larry's presentation and from Manal's presentation, that perhaps the technical systems, the way we deliver it, has undergone a change forever in some fashion. Manal talked about hybrid model. Maybe we will not be giving assistance in the way we used to give in the past. In other words, the COVID-19 will have an indelible mark on how we interact with country authorities. And I think, and the reaction that we received from our country participants is that this is not a bad thing. So that tells us something about the positive aspects. With this, I would like to conclude and thank the panelists for a very, very interesting discussion and presentation. And I would like to take this opportunity to give them a big hand. Thank you so much. So with this, I will conclude, and thank you.